Welcome back, guys, to Strategic Nutrition. And in this module, we're going to be talking about the different approaches and strategies that we can employ as coaches with our clients to maximize their physiological as well as psychological outcomes when dieting and to minimize negative trade-offs. So when we talk about strategic nutrition for body composition, we're going to be discussing the importance of how to teach our clients to adopt an infinite perspective towards nutrition, as opposed to a very short-term ideal or something that they're going to be doing on just acute timescales. We're also going to discuss the strategies and approaches that we can take when planning out various dieting phases, and more importantly, how to adapt nutritional plans and adjust the approach that we take with our clients depending on the feedback and the results they're getting. The typical way that coaches approach nutrition isn't necessarily wrong, but it's rather one-dimensional. We know that we can plan a cutting phase, a bulking phase, but more often than not, it's very simplistic and there's a lot that gets left out. As I said, the typical way that we go about planning our clients' diets is to set a goal, devise a plan, monitor the client's execution of the plan, and then we adjust the plan based on results. But that's not enough in many cases, especially when we're looking to work with clients long-term on improving their body composition. The objective of nutritional coaching is to provide the client with far more than just a diet. We don't want to get only results and rapid weight loss or weight gain, but instead we want to be able to maximize their body composition, minimize the psychological drawbacks when dieting, and ensure that their results are sustainable so that we can minimize yo-yo dieting and weight rebound. And this is what we're going to be discussing today. And a quote that I think sums up what we're trying to achieve in our role as a nutrition coach is to manage weight and body composition as well as health with as much flexibility as necessary and as little effort as possible from the client. So keeping this in mind throughout this presentation is going to be really useful, as it'll start to make sense as we piece together what it takes to be strategic with our clients' diets. Before we dig into the nuts and bolts of diet periodization and what it means to be strategic with nutrition, we must first think long term. Diets don't have an expiration date, and it should be a highly dynamic and long-term approach. The underlying objectives during any dieting phase for the coach are to educate the client about all things nutrition, from energy balance, macronutrient intakes, and just an understanding of the process overall, as well as the habits that they need to develop, the skills, and everything encompassed within nutrition and dieting. We need to address psychosocial implications of dieting, so how that impacts their psychology, their mental well-being, as well as their lifestyle and ability to socialize. We need to teach and increase our clients' self-awareness, their self-control, and minimize cognitive disinhibitions. As I mentioned, we need to teach dieting skills associated with various goals. So we need to teach our clients not just how to lose weight, but also how to maintain that weight loss, as well as gaining weight at an appropriate rate, often the most difficult part of dieting for many individuals. We need to use appropriate tools, strategies, and approaches within certain phases of dieting and make sure that we use them correctly. And we need to teach the ability to transition between rigid, flexible, and ad libitum eating, so eating based on hunger and fullness cues. And most importantly, we need to adapt the approach when required. And this doesn't happen in a 12-week dieting phase or when you set out a cut or a bulk, and it should be the foundation of what you do as a nutritional coach. So, what is strategic nutrition? Quite simply, it's understanding the big picture and how best to navigate towards the client's intended goal. It's periodizing and planning phases of dieting based on various timescales, both in the short, mid, and long term, incorporating strategies within these specific phases in alignment with those overarching goals, and adjusting and adapting the approach dependent on goals, timeframes, and any other confounding factors. Diet periodization, by definition, is typically used to describe changes in nutritional intake in response to certain periods of training. For example, when athletes are performing high intensity, hard training, they're going to have higher calorie intakes versus periods where they're not training as hard. Now, in the context of personal training, this can be the overarching objective of what we're trying to achieve, aligning nutrition with training, as well as lifestyle and the goals of the client. It provides a conceptual model for dieting and a framework to plan controlled variations in calories and macronutrients, as well as allows us to understand how we need to adapt the approach for the client within these goals and these timeframes to ensure that they're maintaining their performance, they're moving closer towards their goal, and most importantly, that we're maximizing or optimizing their health, their physiology, and importantly for them, their body composition. So, as it relates to strategic nutrition, we need to understand some basic concepts and timeframes. So, a macro cycle is long-term, 12 months or longer. It's the big picture and whole diet strategy. So, this is the strategic component of nutrition. So, how do we maximize the overall physiology and psychology of the client? We move down into the second tier, which is a mesocycle. This is midterm, 1 to 3 months, and this is where things are tactical. So how do we set up the diet to achieve sustainable progress whilst maintaining adherence? And you can think of this as setting up, target rates of loss for your client within alignment of certain nutritional phases and training phases. And then we move down to tier 3, which is the microcycle. So this is the short-term daily and weekly plan. So this is actionable by the client. Obviously the focus is on them, and we look at creating a pragmatic and individualized approach. So we're looking here at setting up a calorie deficit over the course of 7 days, how they're going to meet that within their weekly calorie distribution, how they're going to set out their daily food intake, and things like this. And as you can see here, there's an example macro plan for one of my clients, and this was over a 12-month period where the client reached 72 kilos from 85 kilos, and as you can see, there's various phases before we got there. It wasn't just a straight cut or bulk, which is what many coaches would employ, but instead we had a phasic approach to slow things down, make sure that it was sustainable, and maximize physiology, psychology, and as I mentioned, we want to minimize all those negative trade-offs that come with prolonged periods of calorie restriction. So very simple, a fat loss phase for 14 weeks where we lost 10 kilos, a 4-week maintenance phase where we fluctuated between 75 and 76 kilos, then a 24-week gaining phase where we gained 5 kilos, followed by a 4-week maintenance period, and then finally a 16-week dieting phase where we got down to 72 kilos. And body composition within this changed dramatically because we weren't just losing fat the whole time or trying to retain muscle, but we were also building muscle during that 24-week gaining phase, which again helped him look better come the end of the diet. Now, hacking physiology. No matter how much you plan, you cannot hack the body. Fat loss is going to get harder as body weight and calorie intake decreases, and muscle gain gets harder as body weight increases and calories increase. And there's only so much chopping of calories and increasing cardio that can be implemented before the plan simply becomes unsustainable and the adherence of the client will be compromised. And there's only so long you can stuff your face and train with high volumes before you throw in the towel. So there are a number of benefits in periodically including higher and lower calorie intakes to continually promote sustainability of diet, because we know that we can't diet forever, nor should we. So an overview of diet strategies. What are the ways we can manipulate diet variables within specific phases of dieting? Well, we know we have the macro plan, so that's your target weight, whatever goal weights you have, body compositions and things like this. And then we can break that down and really zoom in on the finer details of a microcycle strategy, so how we manipulate food choices, calories and macronutrients throughout the day and the week, whether the goal is fat loss, muscle gain or weight maintenance. And then we can zoom out again into our mesocycle strategies and look at how we manipulate calorie and macronutrient intakes over longer timescales, so the midterm, which is weeks and months. So, how does this apply in the context of fat loss? Well, the macro plan, like I mentioned, is the goal weight. The meso plan is the target rate of loss. Again, this can be anywhere between 0.5 to 2% of body weight, depending on the client's current body fat percentages and any time frames and specific requirements that they have. And then the micro plan is simply the daily and weekly calorie intake, so how we create the all-important calorie deficit. So what happens during a fat loss phase? Well, at the start of a fat loss phase, we have more body fat, hunger is low, we're very full most of the time, we're highly motivated to diet, our recovery capacity is quite high, and we'll have higher non-exercise activity thermogenesis, so we'll burn more calories throughout the day. As we diet down, we lose body weight, calorie intake is reduced, we're going to have low body fat percentages, hunger will start to increase, we're not going to be full as much, our motivation to keep dieting is going to be lower, and our recovery capacity will be compromised, as well as our non-exercise activity thermogenesis will take a big hit. So this is where strategic nutrition comes in, because we can start to devise ways to circumvent some of these negative drawbacks of dieting to allow for sustained periods at a calorie deficit. And it's important to remember that as energy intake goes down, the size of the calorie deficit will decrease due to adaptive thermogenesis. So your total daily energy expenditure is going to be lower, and that will close the size of the energy deficit. So, as you can see, fat loss gets harder over time. As you lose fat, the physiological outcomes in response to such changes make further dieting more difficult because you're hungry, you're lethargic, and as energy intake goes down, the size of the deficit decreases in response to these weight changes. And again, this is adaptive thermogenesis and largely coming from a reduction in your total daily energy expenditure. But where does this come from? Well, research has shown that there's a limit to which resting metabolic rate will fall, so that is the organs and everything like that, with no significant changes after the first 10% of weight loss. So where does that bring us in terms of our reductions in energy expenditure? Well, it's coming from NEAT, like we saw in the above chart. Adaptive thermogenesis will highly influence our non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which means in practice, we're going to be moving less, we're going to be sitting more than we stand, we're going to be fidgeting less, and we're just not going to be burning as many calories throughout the day. This is why getting your clients to track their daily activity levels, whether it's step count or just simply keeping a close eye on what they're doing each day, will come really useful to you in terms of making sure that you can control that energy outside of the equation. So microcycle strategies. Number one, we can manipulate the food, pleasure, and reward. So what this means is that as we diet, we get hungrier, food becomes more pleasurable and desirable, and it takes on a very different meaning. We eat less than we want, which means when we do eat, we want to make it really delicious, and this can be problematic and only enhance and heighten the hedonic power of food. So what we can do to circumvent this is lower the palatability of food, so making it more bland, boring, less flavors, spices, and things like this. We can increase our protein intake because we know that protein is the most satiating macronutrient. Making sure that we eat when we're hungry and ravenous, so not or eating when we're not hungry at all. We can increase our food volume and lower the density of energy within our foods, so opting for meals that are very voluminous, such as salads, vegetables, and starting to reduce our intake of foods that are very energy dense, such as peanut butter, oils, and things like that. We can increase our fiber intake because we know that this can play a huge role in distending the stomach and signaling fullness to the brain. In the same vein, we can water preload, so having large amounts of water before we eat. We can also increase our caffeine intake because we know that caffeine has some appetite suppressing properties. And most importantly, we can be mindful when we eat, so starting to chew slower, placing our fork and our spoon and our cutlery down between bites, and just making sure that we're not distracted when we do eat, so that we have time to recognize that we are eating and we haven't scoffed down all our food without feeling full at all. The second microcycle strategy extends further from a single meal into the day. So how we distribute our calories throughout the day. So this is very much a discussion surrounding the feeding window, the number of meals we eat per day, and how we distribute those calories. So the feeding window simply refers to when we start eating and when we finish eating. So fasting to lower the feeding window is really useful, as it closes the number of hours that we're able to eat, and therefore reducing the number of calories that we're likely to consume. This is where intermittent fasting comes in, and it's a highly popularized and useful strategy, and for great reason. Secondly, the number of meals we eat per day can play a huge role on our hunger and our fullness. So if you're eating 8 meals or more a day, you're going to be constantly focused on food, and you're not going to be very full after you eat a meal. Therefore, the number of meals that you eat should fit within your lifestyle and schedule, but we may need to lower our meal frequencies to minimize this food focus, so perhaps transitioning from, say, 5 meals per day to 4 meals per day, or even less as our calorie intake gets lower and lower over the course of a diet. Finally, how we distribute those calories throughout the day, for example, whether we have smaller meals early in the day or larger meals later in the day, is very useful and can play a large role in dietary adherence. And we've seen a lot of success with teaching our clients how to bias their calories towards the end of the day, when food is preferably consumed and when they're going to be most fatigued and tired. Now, obviously, we know that during the day we make multiple decisions, and this leads to decision fatigue. So by having more calories available in the evening, we're less likely to make poor decisions because we've got more calories available, and this can bolster adherence. Microcycle strategy number 3 is how we distribute the calories across the week. Now, as you guys would have seen in the previous modules, we can have multiple ways in which we can set up our diet over the course of 7 days, having lower calories during the week with refeeds on the weekend. We can have roving high days or carb cycling, or borrowing calories when necessary. So nonlinear dieting, aka distributing weekly calories in an undulating fashion, can maximize adherence, enjoyment, and training performance. So if your client's goals are performance related, having roving high days is really beneficial, because you can allocate carbohydrates to those harder training sessions, and having lower carbohydrate intakes on non-training days. Now, if your client's somebody with a fat loss focus or very lifestyle orientated, we can incorporate refeeds over the weekend, so a 5 low day to 2 high day structure, or we can alter the ratio of low to high days as the dieting phase continues to slow down the rate of loss. For example, what I do with my clients is, at the start of a dieting phase, we'll have 6 low days with 1 high day, and as they start to lose weight and I want to slow down that rate of loss further, we might start to move to a 5 low day, 2 high day structure, and then finally a 4 low day and 3 high day structure. And again, this is really important in minimizing the hunger associated with chronic periods of dieting, as well as giving them a relief from the restriction that comes with dieting. Again, like I said, we can also borrow calories when there are important events or social outings, and it's critical that regardless of the diet setup you achieve within this weekly calorie allotment, you need to make sure that you meet your prescribed and target calorie macronutrient intake over that period, and ultimately ensure that adherence is sustained. So those roving high days, carb cycling that I mentioned, a period of 24 hours with higher carbohydrate intake, typically taking calories to maintenance with the end goal of improving training performance and recovery. Now, we can usually tailor the carb intake around the hardest training sessions, but this could be done the day before if the client's training in the morning, or the day of if the client is training in the evening. Now, the primary benefits of this are that obviously we can improve performance, because carbohydrates play a key role in moderate to high intensity activity, and having more carbs around the workout can aid in recovery, nutrient delivery, and glycogen replenishment. And it's important to remember that the benefits of higher carb intakes are scaled with duration, and the potential drawbacks of having carb cycling could be that it's time not spent at a calorie deficit. So if we move our calories to maintenance while we're obviously reducing the size of the deficit, which means that we're not going to be burning fat, and in the context of a fat loss phase, this might extend the time frame necessary to achieve the target body fat percentage or body weight. Similarly, refeeds are a 24 to 72 hour period where we control overfeeding through carbohydrates, and we can reduce or hold constant protein and fat intake, and this is always going to be planned into your 7-day period. And the primary benefits of a refeed are that it improves adherence, it will reduce diet fatigue, it will improve and elevate mood, potentially increase energy expenditure temporarily. It can, in many cases, reduce stress and water retention through carbohydrates' therapeutic effect on stress mechanisms such as cortisol. And as we know through the roving high days and the importance of glycogen in resistance training, it can improve your training performance, which may lead to more muscle retained when we're in hypercaloric conditions. Again, the drawbacks are simply there's time not spent at a deficit, which means you're going to have to diet longer, and it could potentially increase the likelihood of binging if it's not controlled and the appropriate parameters and structures aren't placed around that refeed. As you guys know, we can set the week up in many ways, but just to recap from the previous module, we have those scheduled refeeds with a 5 low day, 2 high day structure. We'd have our roving high days or carb cycling, or we can borrow calories when we have important social events. And these graphics here can highlight that to you so you can better conceptualize what that looks like over the course of a week. Now, zooming out, we can look to the mesocycle and then how we can mitigate some of those negative drawbacks that we saw earlier when we diet for fat loss. Diet breaks are our first mesocycle strategy, which is simply a prolonged period of calorie maintenance, much like a refeed, just over longer timescales, usually 5 to 10 days. And the benefits of diet break are much the same as a refeed. However, we get a temporal increase in leptin, which reduces appetite, but it only reduces appetite when the cumulative energy deficit will be restored. So because we've been dieting over long periods, we've been at an energy deficit for a sustained period of time, we're not going to completely reduce hunger, we'll just reduce it more than what it was when we were dieting on lower calories. This can significantly improve adherence, especially when the client has a lot of weight to lose or they're going to have to diet over extended periods. Having these little breaks, just like mental relief, can reduce diet fatigue, improve mood, and it's something to look forward to. Again, much like refeeds, we can see a temporal increase in energy expenditure, some drop in water retention in those initial days. However, it's important to note that weight will start to climb the longer you're at maintenance, just because you're eating more food, holding more water because you're eating more carbohydrates. But this is hugely beneficial when you're in the gym, training, because you're going to improve your performance, which again can help you hold on to your muscle and strength. The drawbacks of a diet break are that it's not time spent at a calorie deficit, which means you will need to diet for longer if you're going to plan these diet breaks in. So how do we implement a diet break? Well, we have two options. The first can be proactive, that is planning it ahead of time into the dieting phase. And this is important because if we do this, we need to have buffer weeks and it's going to extend the phase of the diet. And this can improve motivation and desire to diet because your clients can see these little breaks coming and they know that they're going to be able to take the foot off the gas once things get a little bit harder. Typically, we want to include a diet break every 8 to 12 weeks. And again, this is a proactive diet break, meaning that we're planning ahead of time. However, diet breaks can also be reactive. If your client's dieting and cracks start to appear in you, those little red flags are starting to become more and more prominent. That is, the client's hunger is through the roof, their likelihood of non-adherence is increasing, they're really lethargic, their performance in the gym is really suffering, and you've got plenty of time up your sleeve. You might want to call a diet break so that they can just chill out, have some time to eat a little bit more food, reset everything, so to speak, and then push ahead. And what this looks like, if we were to plan it into a fat loss phase, is week 6 there, we have a diet break, and again, at week 12, we have a diet break. Now, there's no hard and fast rules on when you need to have a diet break or the time frames in which they need to be implemented. But again, like I said, generally speaking, every 8 to 12 weeks, can be earlier, can be longer, and usually for 5 to 10 days. Again, it could be 4 days, it could be 12 days. We want to remember that we're implementing principles, not necessarily methods. You can come up with your own methods. And in this graphic here, you can see that we have the 6-week diet break, the 12-week diet break, and then a reactive D-break at week 15 when it was potentially planned for week 18. And again, this could be that the client's getting closer to their target weight, simply need a break because their body fat's low, hunger's high, and all of those adverse outcomes that are associated with weight loss and low energy intakes are starting to rear their ugly heads. The third mesocycle strategy we're going to talk about is a maintenance phase. And building off a diet break, this is an even longer period at maintenance calories with the objective of holding a body weight range to bring our body fat settling point down. And the objective during this phase is to maximize calorie intake at a given body weight range and reverse the physiological and psychological adaptations to changes in body weight and energy intake to further subsequent fat loss phases or to transition into a gaining phase. Now, it's important to remember that when we're trying to estimate our clients' maintenance calorie intakes, maintenance calories are a very dynamic figure, very, very hard to quantify, but we just want to be monitoring their response and feedback, so what their scale weight's telling us, and ensure that we are keeping them within a certain range. So we don't need to maintain an exact weight, we just want to be within a range that you determine as the coach. Now within the maintenance phase, we can continually increase calories because what you'll notice is that once coming out of a calorie deficit, as energy intake increases and the body starts to bring back a little bit of life, and as we start to eat more food, we bring back life to the body, meaning that we start to burn more calories day to day, and therefore we could potentially run into the risk of the client entering into a calorie deficit again. So we might need to continually increase calories over the course of a maintenance phase, and we want to do that because we want to be able to get our clients to eat as much food as possible and be able to maintain their weight, because that's where the magic's going to happen. So this is where we can implement reverse dieting as we stepwise increase calories into maintenance, or we can just simply push calories straight up to maintenance or estimated maintenance and try to work out how much food the client can eat and maintain that weight range. The benefits of a maintenance phase are massive. So we get all the benefits that we saw within refeeds and diet breaks, but over even longer timescales, which means that we can see all of those adaptations that occur when we're at lower calorie intakes and we start to lose body fat really start to slow down and sometimes even reverse. But the problem with a diet break is that in many cases, a maintenance phase, is in many cases your clients aren't going to want to maintain their weight. They want to keep seeing the results week to week to week, and it's very hard to get buy-in from your client to maintain simply because it's not motivating to just stand still. So making sure that you explain to them the importance of a maintenance phase, like a pit stop, so that they can fill up, recharge the batteries, get a change of tires, and then get back on the track and improve their performance when it's time to diet. The final mesocycle strategy we're going to talk about is reverse dieting. I started to touch on that before, but reverse dieting is simply a stepwise increase in calories towards maintenance. So if we don't want to go straight to maintenance, we can start to bring our clients slowly out of the deficit, and this can be a hugely beneficial strategy to helping your clients maintain their weight and also teaching them how to eat at a varied intake of calories. So this is something I use with my clients quite a lot. After I've had an aggressive dieting phase, I'll get them down, a significant amount of weight. We'll lose all those kilos that they wanted to lose, and they buy in. They see the results, and it's really motivating. But once we start to see results, and as the diet ensues, we need to start slowing down the rate of loss and moving towards maintenance. And instead of just bumping their calories up, and they can be quite afraid and fearful of that, I use reverse dieting. So this slows down the rate of loss. It reduces the hunger and fatigue that comes with dieting. They start to see improvements in their performance and obviously improvements in their health. They start to adhere better because they see more and more food coming their way, which is really, really motivating and enjoyable. And most importantly, it can minimize the likelihood of post-diet rebound, because by the time they finish their diet, their calorie intake is slowly increasing. Hunger's lower and lower and lower as the weeks go on, and they're going to just adhere better when the time comes to maintain or go into a gaining phase without just being so hungry that they just binge and throw caution to the wind. Now it's important to note, as you can see on the graph there, that each time we increase calories to our estimated maintenance, we can potentially see that rise in non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which means that we could even be at a calorie deficit in many cases, and the client will continue to lose weight. So as we increase our calories, we need to really monitor whether or not the client's losing weight or they're maintaining or potentially gaining. And again, this is where your assessments and adjustments come into play, and you just need to keep a watch of things. So this is what it looks like over long time scales if we have somebody reverse diet. As you can see there in the graph, we have maintenance calories in the red line, their actual calorie intake in the blue line, so they're creating a calorie deficit for the first 9 weeks, and then their body weight in the yellow dots there. So as they diet, they're in an energy deficit, they start to lose weight over the first 9 weeks, but as we can see, that reduction in calorie intake doesn't necessarily mean we're always going to be at the same size calorie deficit, and that deficit will get smaller and smaller over time before we start reverse dieting at week 9, and that little bump in calories each time doesn't necessarily mean they're out of the deficit just yet, because we get that little bump in activity levels potentially, which means that we're moving more even though we're eating more. And the deficit remains the same, and they continue to lose weight even all the way through to week 16 until maintenance calories are met. And this is again a really useful strategy for many of your clients who may not be familiar with maintaining or gaining, or do have a tendency to binge eat and yo-yo diet, because we get those results early. We start slowly ramping up calories. It reduces the hunger, the fatigue. They start to learn so much more about nutrition, and that they don't always need to eat super low calories to lose weight or maintain their weight. And by the end of the dieting phase, they're eating more food than what they ate when they started, and they're ready to go into a gaining phase and make all the muscle growth and strength improvements that they need to improve their body composition long term. So that's fat loss, and now we can use these same theories and concepts when we talk about muscle gain. So we look at the macro plan. What is our goal weight? What's the meso plan? So our target rate of gain, which is largely going to be predicated by the client's training level of advancement and their genetics. And then we look at the micro plan, so how we set up the daily and weekly calorie intake to create that all-important calorie surplus. As you guessed it, in a gaining phase, we start with lower to moderate body fat percentages. Our hunger is pretty normal. We're motivated to eat more and train hard. Our work capacity is a little bit lower because we don't have as much food or body fat, and our NEAT is a little bit lower simply because we're not eating as much. And at the end of a gaining phase, we have higher body fat, reduced appetite, our motivation to continue eating all this food is lower, our recovery capacity is pretty great, which is awesome, and our NEAT can sometimes increase, but in many cases when people overeat, their NEAT can actually decrease. So an important caveat here is that there's a highly individualized response to overfeeding, and there's a lot of literature looking at this, so I just wanted to point that out to you guys. So we need to have some strategies to circumvent this. So on the first level of the strategies that we have available to us are those microcycle strategies, and number one is manipulating food, pleasure, and reward. So as your appetite is reduced during a gaining phase, food becomes less pleasurable and desirable, so we need to increase the palatability of food, so making it taste a little bit nicer, so that we look forward to eating our meals as opposed to eating just plain old chicken and broccoli, where we're not really going to be excited to eat that when we're eating 4,000 to 5,000 calories. We need to decrease our protein intake to the lower end of the range because protein's very satiating. We need to eat at scheduled intervals, so making sure that we have regular times that we eat so that we can start to align our circadian rhythms with our meal timing to meet our calorie needs. We need to decrease food volume and the density within the food, and we need to decrease our fiber intake as well as our caffeine intake to help ameliorate our appetite so that we're not too full all the time. And rapid eating can be a very useful strategy, so getting down calories really, really quickly as opposed to eating really slowly, because when we eat slowly, all of a sudden we can see how much food we're going to get through, which is not very motivating, and as hunger starts to decline as we eat, we may not be able to meet our calorie needs. So on the microcycle level, we also have some very useful strategies in terms of how we distribute our calories across the day. So when we look at the feeding window, we want to increase our feeding window, which may even mean waking up a little bit earlier to get in those calories and start eating earlier in the day so that we can make sure that we don't have prolonged periods without eating because that makes getting a lot of calories in very, very difficult. So this is where minimizing fasting is super beneficial. When looking to the number of meals we should eat per day and our meal frequencies, obviously it should fit within our lifestyle and schedule, and we don't want it to be anything too crazy or wacky that makes doing our day-to-day tasks overly difficult, but we will need to increase the number of meals we eat per day to increase food focus, and this is where transitioning from 5 to 6 meals when you're on higher calorie intakes, or potentially 6 to 7 meals will be necessary. And how we distribute those calories throughout the day is also really important in a gaining phase, and we will need to bias calories towards times of the day when energy is required or hunger is highest. And this is where monitoring your clients and just getting to know them really well will play a big role in how well you can set up a day's worth of eating for them, because more often than not, people will be hungry around training or after training, but in many cases some people aren't hungry when they train or they do see a reduction in their appetite after training sessions, so you might want to increase their calories on their rest days. So again, this is going to be highly individualized, but just paying attention to your client's response to overfeeding is super important. The third microcycle strategy that we have at our disposal is very similar to a fat loss phase, but it's non-linear dieting, but it takes on a very different meaning within the context of a gaining phase, because no longer are we worried about adherence for the sake of minimizing hunger. We're looking to make sure that we adhere to the plan, getting in more calories than we require, or in some cases than we want. So how we distribute the calories across the week needs to be set up in a way that maximizes adherence, enjoyment of the diet, as well as training performance. So in the context of performance, you can have those roving high days, and they're going to be performance-based for the most part, so you might want to have just a little bit more food before a hard training session or on the day of a training session if it's later in the day. But this is going to be largely dictated by hunger and appetite. So if the client is not hungry on their training days, then you might need to lower calorie intake, because we don't want nutrition to interrupt training performance. If your clients are going to the gym, they're feeling bloated, they're hungry, if they're feeling bloated, lethargic, and they're just not feeling ready to attack the iron, then this is going to be problematic, because during a gaining phase, the objective is to gain muscle and not just eat for the sake of it. So we need to make sure that our nutrition is devised in a way that doesn't interrupt training, and in many cases, altering the distribution of calories across the week will need to account for this. But again, high days and higher calorie intakes on training days can be useful, but some people might prefer higher calories on their non-training days. Adherence and sustainability can be difficult when you're overfeeding and you've been eating at a calorie surplus for a sustained period, which is why higher calories can be consumed when necessary, required, and preferred. If your clients prefer to have more calories on the weekend, you might include a non-linear dieting strategy where they have 5 days at a very, very small surplus and then 2 days over the weekend at a greater surplus, just making sure that again the total weekly calorie and macronutrient intake is met and that they adhere to the plan. And very similar to the dieting phase for fat loss, we can manipulate calorie intake around events and their social life to again make sure they're meeting that surplus. So now zooming out, we can look to some of those mesocycle strategies. Now we can't mass forever. We can't always eat at a calorie surplus, because the rate of muscle gain slows down dramatically, and then we'll start to gain fat at a disproportionate rate to what we will gain muscle. And this is where a mini cut comes in. So a mini cut's a short and aggressive dieting phase which can be used during an extended gaining phase to minimize excess fat gain. So when do you implement a mini cut? Well, when body fat accumulation exceeds a point where it's beneficial to training performance. So typically, if males start to gain so much body fat and they've gone from having visible abs to absolutely no abs, well, it might be time for a mini cut. And the same goes for females. If they're starting to lose all the definition and shape and they're just gaining excess fat that's not necessarily enhancing their ability to train hard and recover, then a mini cut might be warranted. A mini cut can also be used when hunger becomes an issue. So if hunger is affecting adherence over a chronic period, so you're starting to see that the client's just not able to meet their calories over the course of weeks and months, mini-cut can reignite appetite and help them get back on that gain train to further eating at a surplus. And more importantly, if your clients have competitive aspirations, that is, they want to step on stage or they've got to meet a specific weight class, a mini-cut can be used at various time points within the time frames of competition to make sure that they're not getting too far away from stage weight or their weight class. So the duration of mini-cut should last 3 to 6 weeks. Get in and get out. And the rate of loss is going to be quite high because we're coming from a place where we're eating more food, we're going to be holding more mass in our stomach, more glycogen, we're going to be holding more water, and we have more body fat to liberate. So we can be pretty aggressive with the size of the calorie deficit when we're mini cutting. And as you can see here, if we have a 24-week gaining phase, we can plan that mini cut into week 16, run that for 4 weeks, strip off a bit of unwanted body fat, keep us within a healthy weight range, whether it's required for competition or not, and then get back onto the gain train. The second mesocycle strategy is a maintenance phase. The only difference between a maintenance phase in the context of fat loss versus muscle gain, in a gaining phase, we want to spend some time at maintenance to hold a body weight range and raise our muscle mass set point. So instead of continually gaining and gaining and gaining and then cutting and cutting and cutting, maintenance is really useful because it teaches us how to train at a certain body weight, and it allows our body to have time to acclimate to this new weight that we're at, which is really important for being able to retain muscle long term so that we don't lose it when we go back into cutting. So after a gaining phase or during a gaining phase, we can include a lower calorie intake period, so at maintenance, and we want to ensure that during that time we align and get our training to be synergistic with this phase. And obviously with lower calorie intakes, we might not be building as much muscle as we would if we were training with high volumes and eating a high volume of food. So aligning your maintenance phase with a strength phase is really useful in making sure that we A, maintain the muscle that we've built, and B, we don't just keep accumulating fat with lower training volumes and higher intensities. So those are the strategies that we can use as coaches in short, midterm, to achieve our long-term goals with our clients as it relates to their body composition. Moving from there, we need to start to discuss how to be adaptive with our nutritional coaching. So we can have the best laid out plan and be as strategic as we want, but the reality is we're working with people, not robots or machines. So in the real world, things are getting in the way. Scheduling, adherence, your clients might drop off for whatever reason, and we need to learn how to balance the real world with what we want to achieve in theory. And this is where we always want to be striving for improvement and adjusting our expectations. And just remember, if the client deviates so far from what is required to make progress or to adhere consistently to the plan, then you may need to change the approach or the dieting phase. An example of this is if adherence is compromised during a dieting phase, so the client's starting to binge, they're just not tracking their calories, they're not hitting their macros, they're always going over, and they're losing motivation, and it's starting to turn into a big mess, and you've tried all those strategies, you might need to just move to a maintenance phase and potentially get into an extended gaining phase where you reset, recalibrate the system, start building the foundations for the next time you get into that cutting phase. And as you can see on that graphic there, we want to always be striving for optimal, but always be pragmatic and practical with what we're trying to achieve with our clients. Factors that will require you to adapt a plan are varied, and there's a multitude of them, but fitness is a lifestyle, and changes in lifestyle influence our nutrition protocols, and this is really important to remember. So some of the factors that will influence what we do with our clients' diets are going to be their phase of development, their goals. So sometimes people might achieve a target body weight and want to keep losing more weight. They might lose less than their target body weight and be happy with where they're at, and we need to be able to change the plan according to that. Their work patterns may change. For example, if somebody flies for work a lot and they travel interstate, this is going to make dieting for fat loss extremely difficult. So perhaps having a gaining phase or at least a maintenance phase during periods where they have lots of travel is really useful. And in the same vein, if you have people who are shift workers, you need to think about that and how that influences their ability to adhere to the plan. You need to also consider their body composition. So if somebody has very low body fat percentage, well, they may not need more fat loss. They may need to spend more time building muscle. And if they don't have sufficient amount of muscle, they're not going to, improve how they look long term. And this is an important consideration. Their personal circumstances. For example, you could have a client who has been dieting and they're absolutely crushing it, and next minute their cat dies, their partner separates from them, they lose a family member, they lose their job, and it's just an absolute shitstorm of stress in their life that's just going to make further dieting very arduous and not practical at all. And the time of the year. People want to look lean in summer, but they also have longer waking periods and they're going to be out socializing more, which means they're going to have a greater eating window and access to more food, which means dieting during summer may not necessarily be a wise idea. So instead, having a maintenance phase or potentially a small surplus during summer to accommodate that is very important. So this is where understanding of seasons and how people eat in accordance with their seasonal rhythms, so to speak, and motivation again is a huge one. So as your clients diet, their motivation is going to come and go, and they're going to change their mind all the time. So just making sure that you're paying attention to how motivated they are and how much they're enjoying the plan. And again, nutritional age, so looking to how advanced your clients are. You might have some clients where these kind of strategies just don't apply whatsoever because they haven't got the basic habits and behaviors in place to be able to make these kind of changes on such a fine level. And environment is a big one. When people go on holidays, they move house and they're changing their environment frequently, their ability to diet within certain phases is going to be heavily impacted. So making sure that you're paying attention to this, and that's what good coaches do. They pay attention and they look to everything that's happening with their client, and they're not looking at the people they work with as numbers, rather they're humans. So finally, the role of a coach is to use our discretion and the client's feedback and reporting to make an assessment and judgment on which approach will best suit their circumstances and goals, continually monitor their response to the protocol, and always balance the relationship between progress and enjoyment. So to summarize, guys, we need to adopt a more strategic and long-term approach with our clients' diet as opposed to a very one-dimensional and short-term thinking of just trying to get people to lose weight, cut, bulk, and so on and so forth. We need to incorporate these various strategies and manipulate the variables within diet to maximize physiology and psychology and minimize the negative drawbacks associated with dieting. And we also need to adapt the plan based on the client's feedback and results. So guys, I hope that was useful. I hope you found it informative. Be sure to hit me up with any questions that you have, and I'll speak to you all next time.